The smell of a hospital is different from every other smell in the world. It's an impossible mix of floor disinfectant with something like overripe fruit, warmed plastic, and air that has been breathed too many times by too many people who were afraid. I was 19, and I knew that smell better than I should have. My mother had died in a hospital like that when I was 11, and the sense of smell holds memory in a way the mind can't control. Every time I stepped into a corridor like that, something deep in my stomach tightened before I even understood why. The doctor called me by name, in a tone that was already the answer before he said anything else. He was a man in his mid-40s, thin-framed glasses, a lab coat with his name embroidered in navy blue, the kind of face you look at and immediately sense it has been trained for years, not to show anything that isn't calculated. He led me to a corner of the hallway, one of those spaces between two doors that seem designed specifically for bad conversations, and told me, with a clinical coldness I now recognize as a defense mechanism, but that at the time made me physically want to scream, that my father needed surgery, cardiac, urgent. It would cost 40,000 reais. He said it the same way he would have said the time of a follow-up appointment, as if it were neutral information, logistical, a piece of data to be processed and answered. He just stood there looking at me with that controlled expression, clipboard in hand, waiting for me to say something, and I said nothing, because 40,000 reais was a number that didn't fit inside my body. It belonged to another world, to another kind of person, to a reality I only knew from television, but that had never truly brushed against my life. My sneakers had holes in them. I'm not using that as a metaphor. The sole of my right shoe had partially come apart from the upper at the front, and with every step it made a faint, damp sound when I stepped on wet ground. I had 180 reais in my wallet, which was what remained from my salary after rent and bills. I didn't even have a credit card, and my father was on the other side of a glass wall, hooked up to monitors, his heart barely holding on. And the only person in the world who could do anything was me, who had turned 18 11 months earlier and had 180 reais in my pocket. My mother had died when I was 11. Cancer, fast and without ceremony. After that, it was just me and him, my father, a man who had worked his whole life in a warehouse, who never complained about anything, who picked me up from school even when he was exhausted, who taught me how to play chess on Saturday nights with a wooden board he had gotten from a co-worker. It was him. It was only him. I left the hospital on foot. I didn't have money for the bus. The city at that hour of the morning had that specific light of days that have already started wrong. A white, shadowless brightness that made everything equally barren, the sidewalks, the storefronts, the faces of people at bus stops. I walked without a clear destination, but with a desperate sense of purpose. The kind of movement the body makes when the mind knows that stopping is worse than continuing. The first bank branch I walked into smelled like air conditioning and synthetic carpet. I waited 40 minutes in line, explained the situation to a young manager wearing a tie who looked more at his computer screen than at me, and was told I didn't have sufficient proof of income, that I had no credit history, that I had no collateral. He handed me a paper with a call center number and said I could try online. I didn't have internet on my phone that day because my plan had expired. The finance company was located in a commercial corridor between a used phone shop and a newsstand. I was attended by a woman with red hair who listened to my story with an expression that mixed exhaustion with bureaucratic compassion, the kind you develop after hearing bad stories all day for years. She typed in my information, waited, typed again, and then said the system automatically rejects profiles without formal proof of income. I tried an uncle who barely knew me, my father's brother, whom I saw maybe twice a year on holidays. I called from a payphone because my phone credit had run out. He answered after 5 rings, listened to what I had to say, and stayed silent for a moment that felt far too long. Then he said he couldn't help, that he had debts of his own, that he was sorry. I hung up and stood there looking at the street for a moment, my hand still on the receiver, unable to process that this path had also come to an end. Every door I knocked on was a wall. Not a wall with an explanation or someone to blame, just a wall. The world had been built in such a way that 180 reais and 0 credit history equaled 0 options, and no emergency, no love, no legitimate desperation could change that equation. I walked for 4 hours. I didn't eat because it didn't even occur to me to eat. My torn sneaker kept getting wetter as the morning went on. When I returned to the hospital, the sun was different, higher, more direct. I sat down in one of those orange plastic chairs you find in every hospital corridor in Brazil, hard in a way that feels designed to keep anyone from truly resting. I rested my elbows on my knees, my head in my hands, and stared at the linoleum floor, that beige and gray diamond pattern that means nothing, and that I looked at long enough to memorize without meaning to. I wasn't crying. I had passed the point of crying. I was in that state that comes afterward, a kind of functional vacuum where you still physically exist, but something essential has gone somewhere else. It was at that moment that a man sat down beside me. He wasn't the kind of character you imagine when you think of a story like this. There was nothing angelic about him, nothing obviously villainous, nothing cinematic. He was a man in his early 50s. I guessed from the skin on his neck, his hands, the strands of white in his very well-kept grey hair. At first glance, his clothing was simple, dark fabric pants, a plain shirt, closed shoes. But there was a quality to those pieces that took an extra second to register, the kind of simplicity that costs money, that doesn't need anything flashy to communicate what it needs to communicate. He was the kind of man you look at and just know has money without being able to explain why. He sat down and remained silent. He didn't take out his phone, didn't scan the hallway impatiently, didn't cross his arms in that way people do when they're waiting and want everyone to notice. He just sat there with that particular stillness of someone who has learned how to be present in a way most people never do. 2 or 3 minutes like that. I barely noticed when he arrived. When he started speaking, it felt natural. It wasn't the sideways, calculated approach of a scam, the kind you recognize instantly because something about it feels off. The performative kindness of someone who wants something specific. It was a simple question, asked in a tone that didn't necessarily expect an answer, whether I was okay. And I said no. I don't know why I answered with that level of honesty to a man I didn't know. Maybe because I had just spent 4 hours trying to appear functional and composed to banks and finance offices and an uncle who barely knew me, and the weight of that was sitting somewhere close to the surface. The conversation unfolded in a way I can't fully reconstruct now. I don't remember the exact sentences, the precise sequence of things. What I do remember is the way he listened. There was a quality to his attention that felt different. He didn't interrupt, didn't finish my sentences, didn't glance down the corridor. There was something in the structure of how he listened that made you want to complete what you were saying, then keep going, then go deeper. In other contexts, you might recognize it as the technique of a therapist or a skilled interviewer, but in that moment it just felt like the presence of someone who genuinely wanted to know, and I found myself telling him everything. My father, the surgery, the 40,000, the bank, the finance company, my uncle, the 4 hours walking, the shoes, the 180 reais, my mother, who had died in the same kind of orange plastic chair in some corridor just like that one. I don't know when I moved from practical description into something more personal, but he didn't mark that boundary in any way. He just kept listening, and I kept talking, and the whole story came out in a way it hadn't for anyone else that day because there hadn't been anyone to tell. When I finished, there was a pause. He didn't immediately say he could help, didn't use the silence to insert whatever it was he wanted to say. He stayed quiet for a moment, as if he were actually thinking about what he had heard instead of just waiting for his turn to speak. Then he took a card from his pocket. There was no logo on it, just a name and a number, and wrote a second number on the back by hand, with a pen he pulled from his own pocket. He handed it to me and said he could help, that I didn't need to worry about the money right now, that we could talk better later. At that moment, I thought it was a scam. I really did. And it wasn't a distant or abstract thought. It was immediate and specific, with every red flag I could identify, the setting, the timing, the obvious vulnerability I was showing, the offer arriving exactly when I needed it most. But he didn't ask for anything, he didn't request any information, didn't ask for documents, didn't ask about my bank, didn't create urgency. He just said I could call if I wanted. And then he left with the same calm walk he had arrived with, without looking back. I held onto that card for 2 hours. The hallway was still the same hallway. The loudspeaker kept calling for doctors. I stared at that piece of paper with a handwritten number on the back, trying to find the trap. But every line of reasoning led me to the same place. I had 40,000 that didn't exist, a surgery deadline tied to my father's life, and a number written on the back of a card with no logo. I called. The money appeared in my account the next day. 42,000 reais, exact, in a transfer with no identifiable sender beyond a company name I didn't recognize. No contract, no signed document, no collateral requested. Just a short message on my phone from a different number than the one I had called, saying the surgery could be scheduled. I went to the bank to check it at the ATM outside because I didn't have internet on my phone, and I stood there staring at the statement for a length of time that must have looked ridiculous to anyone walking by, a 19-year-old standing in front of a bank screen doing nothing. The number was there, real, with the exact cents, the date, everything a bank statement has. The feeling wasn't joy, not pure relief. It was something layered, something I would take years to name precisely. There was real, immediate relief on the surface because the practical problem had a solution and my father could have the surgery. But beneath that, there was another layer, darker, that I couldn't name at the time but now understand as fear. Not the diffuse, anxious fear of someone in trouble. It was the specific fear of someone who has just received something very expensive from a stranger and still doesn't understand what the price will be. My father had the surgery that same week. It went well. The surgeon came out with that same controlled expression doctors are trained to maintain. but said it had gone well, that he was stable, that in a few days he could go home. I went to see him in recovery one afternoon, while he was still half sedated, his skin carrying that tone of someone who is in the process of being put back together. I sat in the chair beside his bed and watched the monitor displaying his heartbeat with a regularity that was the most beautiful thing I had seen in a long time. He woke up and asked how I had gotten the money. I said I had taken out a loan. He believed me because he wanted to believe, and also because there was no reason not to believe a story that was the only alternative to a truth I couldn't bring myself to tell. I spent about 10 days trying to convince myself that everything had turned out fine, that maybe the man was simply someone wealthy with generous impulses, the kind that exists but is rare, that he wasn't expecting anything beyond a story of gratitude. But then the contact came. The call came on a Tuesday afternoon. I recognized his voice immediately, that particular quality of calm that isn't disguised nervousness, but something more deliberate, more trained. He asked how my father was doing. I said he was well. He said he was glad. And then, without any change in tone, without any transition, without anything to signal that the subject had shifted, he said he needed a small favor, just picking up an envelope at one address and delivering it to another. Simple. It wouldn't harm me in any way. And after that, we'd be even. I knew it wasn't simple. Everyone knows when something isn't simple. It's not about information, it's about frequency, a kind of vibration the body picks up before the mind can organize it. A simple favor isn't repaid with 42,000 reais. A simple favor isn't offered by a stranger in a hospital hallway. A simple favor doesn't come after a week of calculated silence. I knew that with every part of me that understands those things. But I went. The address was an apartment in a neighborhood I didn't know well, with a discreet front desk, an elevator that smelled like cigarettes. A man who didn't give his name handed me a medium-sized manila envelope with nothing written on the front. The other address was a townhouse in a residential area, a doorbell that didn't work, a man in a lab coat who opened the door before I could knock. I handed over the envelope. He closed the door without saying a word. On the way back, I didn't open the envelope. I didn't ask what it was. I didn't ask who it was for or what was inside. And when I got home that night and sat down on the only couch in the apartment I shared with two other guys, I understood, with a clarity that felt almost physical, as if the thought had weight, that I had crossed a line. It wasn't marked on the ground, no one told me exactly when it had happened, but there was a before the envelope and an after, and I was in the after, and the after had no way back. The second favor came 3 days later. The favors grew in scale with a gradualness that I now recognize as the most efficient design possible for a trap. It wasn't a visible escalation, it was like the tide. You don't see the water rising, you just realize it's deeper than it was. At first it was deliveries, envelopes, packages of varying sizes, always without explanation. Then it was messages for specific people in specific places, memorized phrases, delivered, with no reply expected. After that, it was observing certain streets or establishments for a period of time and reporting movement, foot traffic, schedules. I never asked what it was. I never asked who it was for, where it was going, why it existed. I learned that silence without anyone having to formally teach me. It was an osmotic learning process, absorbed from others who had been in it longer, from the way they answered or didn't answer, from the pauses that followed when someone asked the wrong question. There was an older man who worked with me at that time, Dinho, in his 40s, a face that had spent too much time in the sun, a calm that wasn't serenity but absolute emotional efficiency. Once he saw me about to open my mouth to ask a question to one of the contacts. I don't even remember what I was going to ask anymore. Something about a destination, about contents, anything that seemed natural but wasn't, and he grabbed my arm with a discreet firmness like someone adjusting an object before it falls. Later, when we were a block away, he said, "Around here, the most valuable currency there is not knowing anything." I memorized that, literally memorized it. I kept repeating it to myself afterward, let it settle, understood its weight. Not knowing anything wasn't naivety, it was protection. It was the only way to avoid being held accountable for what couldn't be named. One night, the police stopped me at a checkpoint on a state highway. It looked like a routine inspection, but there were too many officers for a normal stop, cars positioned in a very specific way. I had a package on the back seat, wrapped in craft paper, no label. My hand was on the steering wheel, and it was shaking with an intensity I tried to control and couldn't. The sweat on the back of my neck was different from normal sweat, colder, more immediate, as if my body knew before I did what was at stake. One of the officers asked for my documents, looked at my face long enough, then glanced at the back seat. He asked what it was. I said I didn't know, that I had picked it up to deliver to someone I knew, that he would be waiting on the other side. My voice came out steady. I don't know where that steadiness came from, because inside it was panic. They searched the car, opened the trunk, checked under the seats, went through my documents twice. The package stayed on the back seat for 40 minutes while all of this happened. They didn't open it. I never found out why. whether there was no legal basis to inspect it without cause, or if there was some reason I would never understand. At the 40th minute, one of the officers handed my documents back and said I could go. I drove for 15 minutes before pulling over onto a side street and sitting there with the engine off, breathing in a way that took a long time to return to normal. The different meeting happened weeks later. It wasn't in a bar, it wasn't in an office, it was in an ordinary house in a residential neighborhood. The kind of place you pass by without a second glance. A standard iron gate, a small, unremarkable yard, a light on in the front window like any other house on that street. Inside, it was a living room with nothing that stood out. Chairs arranged in a semicircle, a table in the center, a shuttered window. There were 8 men, different ages, the youngest maybe 25, the oldest around 60. They sat with that particular restraint of people who know they don't need to prove anything. No one spoke loudly, no one gestured excessively. The only sound was the ceiling fan turning and the distant noise of the street. The man from the hospital hallway was seated in the center. He looked at me with that expression I had already learned to read. Not exactly warm, but acknowledging, the kind of look that tells you you've been observed longer than you realized. He said I had done well, that I had shown judgment where judgment was necessary, and that now it was time to truly enter. I didn't immediately understand what truly enter meant. The phrase hung in the air for a second, and then one of the men stood up and placed a metal bowl on the table. It was a simple bowl, unadorned. What was inside it was dark, thick, and it took me a second to recognize it: blood. Each man in that room cut his own thumb with a small knife. The knife passed from hand to hand with a kind of ceremony that wasn't dramatic, just precise, like the steps of a familiar procedure. Each one let a drop fall. The bowl reached me along with the knife. I cut, I let it fall. And when the bowl reached my lips, I drank, a sip that was more symbolic than physical, but that had a taste that lingered far longer than any taste should. The man from the hospital looked at me and said, "Now you are ours and we are yours." At the time it felt solemn, almost beautiful in a strange way. Later, I understood the real weight of those words. Ours wasn't emotional belonging, it was ownership. And yours wasn't protection, it was permanent indebtedness, a debt that would never reach zero. What came next was a life that existed in 2 completely separate registers at the same time. On the outside, an apartment, a car, clothes that weren't torn, bills paid on time. A normal guy in his 20s who worked in logistics. On the inside, a growing series of tasks that no one ever called by what they really were. The first heavy task was intimidating a shop owner who was late on a payment. I went with a man named Regis, broader than he was tall, few words, a physical presence that didn't need any gesture to communicate what it did. We walked into the shop, I said what needed to be said with a voice I had learned to calibrate for that specific purpose, and the shop owner went pale and started stuttering. Regis did nothing except exist in that space. I left with that awful feeling in my stomach that wasn't exactly guilt, it was the recognition that I had become something I never wanted to be, a function, not a person. I went home, didn't eat, tried to sleep, and couldn't. But I went back the next day, and the next, because there was no way not to go back. The line I had sworn I would never cross was crossed on a Thursday night, in a warehouse outside the city, with Regis by my side, and an order that left no room for interpretation. I won't describe what happened there in unnecessary detail. I'll just say there was a person on the other side of that order. That person had no way out, and I carried it out. It wasn't like in the movies, it wasn't quick, it wasn't clean, there was no soundtrack. It was horrible in a banal, everyday way, as if horror of a certain magnitude refuses drama and insists on the ordinary. When it was over, I went to a corner of the warehouse and threw up. Regis watched me without saying anything. On the way back, I stared out the car window the entire drive, and I realized something inside me had shut off. It wasn't regret. It was more like a switch had been flipped in a part of me that needed to go silent so the rest could keep functioning. The years that followed were the most schizophrenic of my life. I learned accounting from an accountant the organization kept, a 60-year-old man named Sue Walmir, thick prescription glasses, absolute calm. He taught me how to launder money with the same cadence he would use to explain how to file taxes, shell companies, corporate registrations, transactions that turned money with weight into profit that looked legitimate on paper. Once, I asked him how he had gotten into it. He took off his glasses, wiped them with his shirt, and said, "The same way you did." We never spoke about it again. It was during this period that I found the old records. I was alone in a room reviewing spreadsheets late at night when I noticed a folder in a steel cabinet that no one had mentioned and that I had never been explicitly told not to open. I started reading, not fully understanding at first what I was looking at, and little by little I began to piece together the structure of what I was part of, when it had been founded, how many people had passed through it, how many were still in it, how the selection of new members worked, and then I found my name, not my birth name, a code, the same one they used to refer to me internally. It was on a list dated months before that day in the hospital, months before I had met the man, months before the envelope, the ritual, any of it. My father's debt, the timing of the illness, the exact hospital corridor, the precise kind of desperation I had been displaying that day. I hadn't been found by chance. I had been chosen. I stared at that folder for a length of time I can't measure. The mind doesn't process that kind of information quickly. It moves in layers. The first was numbness. The second was a slow, systematic understanding of every moment I had thought was coincidence. The third was a contained anger that settled somewhere inside me, somewhere I had to learn not to visit often. I closed the folder, put it back exactly where it had been. I didn't tell anyone, because I already knew enough to understand that speaking was far more dangerous than staying silent, but something had changed. I began to observe the structure with a different kind of attention. I mapped who answered to whom, why, according to what logic. It was survival instinct disguised as curiosity. The years that followed were the most schizophrenic of my life. I learned accounting from an accountant the organization kept, a 60-year-old man named Sue Walmere, thick prescription glasses, absolute calm. He taught me how to launder money with the same cadence he would use to explain how to file taxes, shell companies, corporate registrations, transactions that turned money with weight into profit that looked legitimate on paper. Once I asked him how he had gotten into it. He took off his glasses, wiped them with his shirt, and said, "The same way you did." We never spoke about it again. It was during this period that I found the old records. I was alone in a room reviewing spreadsheets late at night when I noticed a folder in a steel cabinet that no one had mentioned and that I had never been told not to open. I started reading, not fully understanding at first what I was looking at, and little by little I began to piece together the structure of what I was part of. When it had been founded, how many people had passed through it, how many were still in it, how the selection of new members worked, and then I found my name, not my birth name, a code, the same one they used to refer to me internally. It was on a list dated months before that day in the hospital, months before I had met the man, months before the envelope, the ritual, any of it, my father's debt, the timing of the illness, the exact hospital corridor, the precise kind of desperation I had been showing that day. I hadn't been found by chance. I had been chosen. I stared at that folder for a length of time I can't measure. The mind doesn't process that kind of information quickly. It moves in layers. The first was numbness. The second was the slow, systematic understanding of every moment I had thought was coincidence. The third was a contained anger that settled somewhere inside me, somewhere I had to learn not to visit often. I closed the folder, put it back exactly where it had been. I didn't tell anyone, because I already knew enough to understand that speaking was far more dangerous than staying silent. But something had changed. I began to observe the structure with a different kind of attention. I mapped who answered to whom, why, according to what logic. It was survival instinct disguised as curiosity. Over time, I rose through the ranks. The man from the hospital, whom I came to refer to internally as the old man, began to include me in larger decisions, first as an observer, then as a consultant, then as an active voice. There was a ceremony when I took on the position of guardian, the role of the one who conducts the rituals, who preserves the tradition, who sits in the central chair. By the time my turn came, I already knew every detail by heart. I sat in the central chair. I looked at the faces in the room and thought about the 19-year-old boy in the hospital corridor. I didn't feel pride. I felt the weight of something that no longer had a measurable size. I conducted the ritual. I passed the knife. I held the bowl, and I understood that I had become exactly what the old man had been when he found me. Reaching the top wasn't a single event. It was a transition so gradual I barely noticed when it happened. I just looked around at a certain point and realized I was the one at the center. 3,000 men, directly and indirectly spread across 6 states, companies, properties, influence in places I won't name here. But absolute power is a lie the top tells you so you won't look any higher. Because there is always someone above. In my case, they were people I never met in person, who communicated through intermediaries, who never signed anything, people inside structures that were supposed to be the opposite of what I represented, and they controlled me the same way I controlled those below me. The chain didn't end where I thought it did. The order that nearly destroyed me came in a text message, a name, a date, 11 days. I knew that person, a federal police officer who had started pulling on a thread that, if followed through, would dismantle years of structure. The message was clear in what it didn't say. I stared at it and felt, for the first time in many years, that same cold from the hospital corridor. I spent 11 days trying to find a way out that didn't exist. Just like I had when I was 19, and just like then, I found none within the rules of the world I was in. I didn't carry out the order. That's the part that surprises people, because after everything I had done, after every line I had crossed, it sounds contradictory, but There was still a line inside me, thin, almost erased, buried under years of other layers, but still there. And that specific order was on the other side of it. I can't fully explain why that one and not another. Maybe because there was something about that man, a federal officer doing his job, trying to dismantle what I represented, that was different from all the others I had acted against before. I did the only thing left. I went to him in person, without telling anyone, and I told him everything. Not out of heroism, not out of sudden repentance that erased what I was. Out of survival calculation. It was the only move that kept me alive without forcing me to become something I could no longer be. I brought documents, records, names. I spent 3 days in a secure location being interrogated by different teams, repeating the same story dozens of times, answering the same questions from different angles. By the 4th day, I already knew I wouldn't be leaving free. My cooperation had value, but what I had done over all those years carried a weight that didn't disappear through collaboration. The sentence was read in a cold room. My lawyer had secured reductions, but the final number was still greater than the time I had left to live. I listened to it sitting down, without handcuffs, without any expression I could consciously control. The reality settled in gradually over the following days, inside the cell. My father came to visit me once, at the beginning. He walked into the visitation room with an expression I will never be able to forget. It wasn't anger, it wasn't disappointment in the usual sense. It was something heavier, older, more complex. It was the face of someone realizing he was looking at the result of an equation he didn't know existed. We sat across from each other for a long time without speaking. Then he asked when it had started. I said, "That day in the hospital." He closed his eyes, stayed like that for a few seconds. When he opened them, I saw that he understood the full equation, that the surgery that had saved his life had cost mine. He never came back to visit after that. I understood. I've been here for 11 years. The cell has a small window that catches afternoon light for about 3 hours. The routine is so mechanical that time stops functioning as time and starts functioning as undifferentiated blocks. Morning, afternoon, night, morning again, without days meaning much as individual units. There is too much time to think, more than any human being should have. What I think about most often isn't what I did. It isn't the people I hurt, it isn't the sentence. It's the 19-year-old boy in the hospital corridor, with torn sneakers and 180 reais, staring at the beige and grey linoleum, without knowing that the trap had already closed around him before he even walked into that hospital. The trap wasn't the envelope, it wasn't the ritual, it wasn't the first order I followed. The trap was the moment I called the number on the card, and even that was already part of a plan that had existed months earlier, built around the specifics of my vulnerability, my love for my father, my lack of support. The precise desperation of that specific day. What eats at me isn't regret, in the way people imagine. Regret with tears and atonement and the implicit hope of absolution. It's clarity, a brutal, almost cruel sharpness with which I can now see every step that brought me here. A clarity I didn't have at the time, and that now serves no purpose other than to exist. I'm writing this because sometimes people need to hear it from the inside, from truly inside. And what I can say is this: there is never a favor without a price. There is never generosity without intention in contexts where it appears too perfect at the perfect moment for the perfect person. And when someone appears in your life exactly when you are most vulnerable and offers exactly what you need, you should feel far more fear than gratitude. I didn't. I paid with everything I had. My father is 73 now. He still lives in the same apartment. A cousin told me that a few months ago, in passing, without knowing how important that information was to me, sometimes I wonder if he still thinks about me, if he can see, beneath everything I became, the boy who called the number on the back of the card because he loved him and couldn't find another way. Probably both at the same time. I would understand. I do understand. The surgery that saved his life cost me mine. And somehow I think I knew from the beginning that the bill would come due one day.